first thing the wolves found was her shoe, half buried in the red dust, torn at the heel, small enough for a child with bones like twigs and feet that hadn't finished growing. One of the scavengers sniffed it, sneezed, then padded on past. The sun was just crawling up from the far ridge, lazy and pale, its warmth not yet strong enough to soften the morning frost clinging to the wagon ruts. Lila sat about 30 feet away, knees drawn up to her chin, back pressed against a scorched cottonwood stump. She didn't move, didn't flinch when a raven passed overhead or when the wind snapped the brittle grass around her ankles. Her face was streaked with dust, not tears, she was too hollow for those now. They'd left her at dawn, didn't even shout her name, didn't call out with an apology or warning, just tossed her a chunk of hard biscuit, more crumb than bread, and told her to be brave now. Then the wagon rolled on, one wheel squeaking with each turn, the sound fading into the prairie hush like a ghost losing its way. Lila hadn't run after them, not because her legs wouldn't carry her, but because something inside her had already stopped. She knew the rule. If they didn't look back, neither should she. That's how the trail worked. Blood didn't guarantee kindness, and pity was just a flicker in a stranger's eyes before they closed the door. The crust sat beside her now, untouched. A coyote had come near during the night, sniffed it, then backed away. Even the wild didn't want the offerings of cowards. The sky was high and too blue, the kind that made your thoughts loud in your head. All around, the earth cracked in spider webs, brittle from months without rain. The only signs of life were the circling hawks and the bones half buried in the dust cattle, mule, maybe even man. Lila watched the horizon with the kind of patience only despair could teach. Her hands were tucked under her thighs, fingers blistered and scraped raw from trying to hold on to a family that had already let go. Then came the hoofbeats. She heard them long before she saw him. Not the thunder of a posse or a merchant's caravan, but a slow, deliberate rhythm. One rider, maybe two, but the gait was lazy, measured, almost indifferent, like whoever was approaching had nothing to fear and nowhere to hurry to. She stood, not to wave, not to cry out, but just to be seen. She didn't trust rescue, didn't expect it, but there was a kind of stubborn dignity in refusing to be mistaken for dead. From the crest of the hill, a man appeared. He sat tall on a roan gelding, hat low over his brow, duster trailing like a tattered banner, a rifle slung over his back, saddle worn but well kept. His face was shaded, but the way he rode, casual but alert, said he'd seen more fights than a preacher's seen funerals. He didn't speak when he drew near, just reined in, looked down at her with eyes like weathered stone, and said nothing. Lila stared back, jaw set. She didn't plead. If this was another kind of leaving, she'd rather it be silent. After a long breath, the man dismounted. He moved slow, like a man twice his age, boots crunching gravel as he stepped around her without touching. He knelt by the crust of bread, picked it up, looked at it, then at her. That all they left you? His voice was gravel. Lila nodded once. He said nothing more, just took off his glove, tore the crust in half, handed one piece back to her. Then he turned, walked to his saddlebag, and pulled out a dented canteen and a wool blanket. She didn't move. He didn't ask her to. He laid the blanket beside her, poured a capful of water, and set it down like one would for a stray dog, gentle, careful not to spook. Then he sat on the stump next to hers, leaned forward with elbows on his knees, and stared out at the horizon like they were just two travelers resting on the trail. No introductions, no questions, just a silence between them so thick it might have had shape. Lila sipped the water. It was warm, metallic, but it steadied her hands. She didn't know his name, didn't need to, not yet. What mattered was this: he stayed. And when the wind shifted and the wolves howled again further off this time, he didn't flinch. They sat that way till the sun rose high and the dust settled soft between their boots. The girl didn't say a word the entire ride. Not when he lifted her onto the horse, not when he handed her the canteen again, not even when they passed the half-rotted carcass of a mule, stripped down to bones and memory, left to bleach under the same sun that had turned her lips to sandpaper. She just held on, not to him, but to the saddle horn, like she was riding into judgment. Jacob Harrow didn't press, never did. Pressing people led to lies, and lies got men shot. He knew better than most that silence was a kind of truth. They rode in the rhythm of the land, the slow grind of hooves over dry trail, leather creaking, distant crows calling like old drunks from a saloon porch. The wind came in low and mean across the grasslands, kicking up red dust that clung to skin like guilt. The trail sloped westward, winding through patches of sagebrush and low mesquite. The sun overhead was merciless, but Jacob didn't complain. He'd known worse Apache heat, gun smoke in the lungs, and the stench of dying men in a barn he never visited twice. This was just Tuesday. He glanced back at her once, just once, when her hand started to slip from the horn. She caught herself before he could say a word, and he looked forward again. That was enough. They made it to the rise just past Widow's Bluff around midday. His cabin came into view below squat, weather-stained, built of stubborn pine and mule sweat. The kind of place a man retires to when there's nothing left to outrun but himself. The girl's eyes tracked the roofline like a hawk measuring distance. Not curious, not hopeful, just measuring. Jacob dismounted with a grunt, tied off the reins, then turned to lift her down. She flinched at his hand, so he stepped back. She slid off the horse on her own, knees trembling but not folding. Dust rose around her boots like ghosts unsure of where to settle. He opened the gate. It squealed like it always did and let it close behind them without a word. Inside the yard, a rusty windmill spun half-heartedly, creaking in the breeze. One chicken clucked like it owned the place. It didn't. Jacob barely did. He led her to the cabin porch and held the door open. She stepped inside slow, eyes scanning corners, shelves, and shadows like someone who'd lived too long among things that looked safe but weren't. The air inside smelled of old wood, horses, and coffee grounds burned 2 days back. Dust hung in sunbeams like quiet secrets. A single oil lamp sat on the table, wick bent, never lit unless needed. Jacob set down his hat, poured water into a tin cup, and slid it across the table. The girl took it with both hands. "You got a name?" he asked. She sipped, eyes on the grain of the tabletop. Then, "Lila." It came out flat. No inflection, like someone else had once given it to her and she'd only borrowed it since. He nodded, like that was all he needed. For now, it was. Jacob moved to the stove, pulled out what remained of last night's beans, and scooped it into a pan. He didn't ask if she was hungry. If she wasn't, the smell would do its work. Lila stood in the doorway between light and shadow, watching him with the stillness of someone who had seen too much and said too little. He could feel her gaze, not trusting, not frightened, just measuring again. He set 2 bowls on the table, one full, one half. She didn't touch it. He ate his slow. No need to rush a quiet meal. Halfway through, she sat down, picked up the spoon, started to eat. No thank you, no questions. But her hands stopped shaking. Outside, the sky darkened near the horizon. A storm maybe, or just the way light played tricks out here where God forgot to smooth the edges. Jacob rose, walked to the door, and stared out across the land scrub, silence, and the line where earth meets sky like 2 strangers afraid to touch. Behind him, the girl finished her bowl. He didn't turn when he spoke. "Place ain't much," he said, "but it holds together. If you're willing to help, it'll hold for both of us." She didn't answer, but the scrape of her bowl being set in the wash basin told him enough. Outside, the wind shifted just slightly, as if the land itself had noticed the presence of someone new and wasn't sure yet whether to welcome her or warn her. The axe was too heavy for her hands. She gripped it anyway. Lila stood behind the cabin in the early light, her boots sinking into frost-hardened mud, breath fogging in the cold. A pile of chopped cedar waited like a dare beside her, stacked neat and square by Jacob before dawn. He hadn't told her to split kindling. He never told her much of anything, but she'd seen how the stove sputtered low last night, and she hated the way her fingers stiffened in the morning. So she tried, raised the axe, missed the center. Again, the blade caught crooked on the edge of the log and bounced off, jarring her shoulder. She gritted her teeth and lifted it again. Her palms were blistered from holding reins too tight. Her arms were bruised from God knows how many wagon rides, but she kept swinging. From the porch, Jacob watched, arms crossed, pipe unlit. He didn't stop her. He didn't offer to take over. That wasn't the way out here. A person either learned, or the land taught them something harder. When the log finally cracked, Lila exhaled through clenched teeth and dropped the axe. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either, just wiped her nose on her sleeve and picked up the next chunk of wood. Jacob walked down, picked up the split piece, nodded. "You stack, I'll chop," he said. She didn't say thank you, but when he raised the axe, she followed him without a word. The chores filled the morning, mending fence posts torn down by mule deer, patching a roof tile that rattled in the wind, brushing down the mare with stiff bristles and patient hands. Jacob showed her without speaking, motioned once, stepped back, let her learn. It was the first time in weeks she felt useful, not just tolerated. By mid-afternoon, the wind kicked up across the open field behind the barn. Dust carried in from the south, bringing the scent of distant mesquite fires and the bite of oncoming weather. Jacob squinted toward the horizon, then checked the sky, always watching the signs, always reading the world like a worn trail map. Leela saw him pause. That pause, a 2-second stillness, like a man catching a smell he didn't like, planted something uneasy in her chest. She didn't ask what he saw. She just picked up another post. Inside the cabin, Jacob pulled a strip of jerky from the hanging rack and tossed her half. She chewed in silence, watching the fire dance behind the stove grate. Her fingers had stopped shaking. Her shoulders didn't hunch anymore, but her eyes still darted every time the wind howled. Jacob finally spoke. "You ever mend leather?" Lila shook her head. He laid a worn bridle on the table and a tin of pitch beside it. "Try." She sat across from him, took the needle, watched his calloused hands once, then mimicked the motion. The bridle's edge was cracked, brittle, like trust, like memory. The stitch was crooked. She tore it out and tried again. Jacob didn't correct her. Later, as dusk bled across the sky, Lila sat on the porch step, rubbing her sore fingers, listening to the coyotes sing somewhere off in the canyons. Jacob was inside, sharpening his knife with that slow, rhythmic scrape that filled the cabin like a hymn. Lila watched the horizon again. Same place she'd come from, same place they'd left her behind. But tonight, it didn't feel quite so close. She thought about the crust of bread, about the girl who hadn't run, about the wolves that hadn't dared take her, and about the man who sat beside her now, silent as stone, but solid just the same. There was a single word carved into the gatepost that morning. Lila. Rough letters, crooked and shallow, scratched in with the point of a rusted nail. They weren't bold or proud, more like a whisper pressed into wood, but they were there. Jacob didn't ask about it, just stared at it for a long time as he cinched the saddle onto the roan, boots crunching through frost-thinned dirt. The girl stood nearby, chewing on a piece of jerky like it owed her something. She watched him from under her ragged hat, the same one he'd found in the loft, cleaned up and dropped beside her bed without a word 2 nights back. She hadn't thanked him. He hadn't expected her to. But now her name was on the gate. That meant more than words. "You ride today," he said. She nodded once, didn't flinch. They rode north along the ridge, through groves of pinyon and dry creek beds where quail scattered like secrets. The sky hung low and pewter-colored, like it couldn't decide whether to cry or keep its silence. The air smelled of old sage and winter coming. Jacob watched the land with the eye of a man who'd lost things out here: horses, friends, time, and didn't trust it not to take more. He wasn't worried about weather. It was something else. Something in the way the ravens flew that morning, low, silent, too many of them at once. Lila didn't speak. She rode steady now, back straight, hands light on the reins, not skilled, but not scared anymore either. The saddle no longer swallowed her. She sat in it like she meant to stay. They stopped at an overlook where the world dropped out into a wide stretch of valley. Below, the fence line snaked through grassland like an old scar. Windmills spun in the far distance. Dust clouds kicked up here and there, cattle maybe, or something else. Jacob dismounted, unslung his rifle, and scanned the ridge. Nothing moved, but something didn't feel right. He lit a smoke, offered the matchbox to Lila. She shook her head. He flicked the match, took a long draw, then blew smoke into the wind. "That name on the gate," he said, eyes still on the valley. "Yours?" Lila shrugged. "Was once. Don't know if it still is." Jacob didn't reply, just nodded like he understood, and he did. Names didn't mean much out here, not unless someone called you by one and meant it. That night, back at the cabin, Jacob sat at the table working a whetstone along his Bowie knife. Lila wiped down the lantern chimney, then checked the woodpile without being told. Her hands were blistered, her nails blackened with dirt. But there was something steady in the way she moved now, like she had weight again, shape again. Jacob slid open the drawer in the table and took out a tin box. He'd only opened it once since the war, once when the baby girl was born, once again when the grave was dug. Inside were documents, a deed, and a folded letter with dried lilac pressed between its pages. He ignored those. He took out a branding iron instead. Simple, unused, carved with a JH, the mark he never got around to burning into anything. "Tomorrow," he said, "we brand the fence." Lila looked at him, not surprised, just still. Later, when the fire burned low and the coyotes yipped out past the ridgeline, Lila sat up in bed and listened to the silence. She thought of her mother's voice, already faded to a whisper in her memory. She thought of the wagon, the dust, the way they never looked back. She thought of that crust of bread, and the way Jacob had torn it in two, and handed her half without saying anything at all. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling old pine, cracked and nodded and whispered the name carved into the gatepost like a prayer. Her name. Somewhere in the dark beyond the porch, boots crunched against frozen dirt, slow, deliberate, and not Jacob's. The gate was open when Jacob returned from the creek. He hadn't left it that way. The breeze carried no scent of cattle, no churned-up hoofprints to speak of, just dust, and something quieter, colder. Lila stood at the edge of the porch, rifle in her arms like it belonged there. Her face was still, but her eyes weren't. "Riders," she said. Jacob didn't ask how many. She wouldn't have spoken if it were nothing. He stepped past her, squinting toward the fence line. Just over the rise, near the cottonwood grove, 3 figures on horseback waited like buzzards too proud to circle. One of them raised a hand, not a wave, not a threat, just a signal. They weren't in a hurry. That was the problem. They came down slow, kicking up dust in deliberate measure, as if they wanted their approach noticed. The lead rider wore a tan duster stiff with trail grime, boots black as coal, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed half his face. But Jacob knew him before he spoke. Amos Kane. He'd ridden this land before, years back, always with the same claim, that the Harrow acreage belonged to his father, who died broke and bitter, and left nothing but old stories and angrier sons. "Jacob," Amos said, drawing the name out like a knife dragged across rope. "Didn't figure you still had company out here." Jacob didn't answer. He stepped in front of Lila without a word, his body a quiet barrier. The other 2 riders, younger, mean-eyed, said nothing. They stared at the porch, at the girl behind the rifle. She didn't blink. "You know why I'm here," Amos continued. "We both do." Jacob scratched his beard, spat into the dust. "That fence line's mine, Kane, always was. I got the deed." Amos smirked. "Deed don't mean much if no law rides to read it." Jacob's voice stayed level. "I ride law enough for this line." Silence stretched between them, tight and dry like sun-baked rope. Kane's eyes flicked toward Lila. "She yours?" he asked, tone casual. "She's here." Amos sniffed. "Didn't know you were the fathering kind." Jacob took a step forward. "Just one." "You're finished here." Kane chuckled, reins tightening beneath his fingers. "We'll be back. Bring the paper if you want. Bring the law if you find any, but I got blood and memory on this land, and I aim to take back what's mine." He turned his horse with a nudge of his heel. The 2 riders followed. Dust rose in their wake like a bad omen. Jacob waited until they were specks on the ridge before speaking. "Get the rifle cleaned," he said, still staring at the trail. "You'll keep it near." Lila didn't move right away. Her hands were tight around the wood, not out of fear, but something else, something she didn't know how to name yet. She walked inside. Jacob stayed on the porch, the breeze ruffling his shirt collar like a whisper. He remembered a younger Amos, a boy who'd once cried when his father beat a mule half to death. But time had a way of taking the good and feeding it to the land. What came back wasn't always worth saving. That night, Jacob unrolled the deed again. He spread it flat across the table, weighed it down with a coffee tin. Lila stood nearby, brushing her damp hair with her fingers. The lamplight caught her profile, thinner now, but firmer somehow. "This place ever have a name?" she asked. Jacob looked up. "Number." She nodded. "Then we should give it one, so we remember where to stand." Outside, the moon hung low, yellow, and mean-looking, while the wind pushed against the cabin like something testing the walls. Jacob didn't sleep. Neither did the girl. Beyond the fence, hoofprints marked the earth like a warning written in dust, and the wind began to howl like it remembered every name carved into forgotten wood. The envelope smelled of gun oil. Lila found it on the table, weighed down with a tin cup, addressed in a square, calloused hand, to the sheriff of Caldera Ridge. No frills, no wasted words, just like Jacob. He was already in the saddle by the time she stepped outside, buckling his saddlebags beneath a sullen sky. The morning air was sharp with frost and something unsaid. "I'll be gone 3 days," he said, without looking at her. "Maybe 4, if rain hits the pass." She didn't ask what for, but she knew. The deed, the law, a name on paper might be all that stood between Amos Kane and the land she'd carved her name into. Jacob studied her face for a beat longer than usual. "There's bullets in the drawer," he said. "Keep the rifle close. Don't shoot unless they cross the fence." She nodded. He tugged his hat lower and rode off without another word, dust rising behind him like a curtain falling on a stage. The cabin settled into silence. Lila cleaned the rifle, twice, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. the cloth soaked in oil, the barrel cold and clean. It was Jacob's rifle, long, older than her, with a worn walnut stock and a kick that could rattle bone, but it sat in her arms like it belonged there now. Outside, clouds gathered low over the hills, the kind of clouds that promised trouble, but never came fast enough to outrun. She checked the lock on the gate, checked it again, fed the chickens. Boiled coffee she didn't drink. Every hoofbeat in the distance made her stop and listen. Every creak of the porch boards made her check the rifle's chamber. That night, she lit only one lamp, left the others dark. She sat in Jacob's chair, rifle across her lap, boots on the floor, staring through the window where the curtain had been torn 2 weeks ago and never fixed. The moon spilled a mean silver across the yard. She thought of that first crust of bread, the one they'd thrown her like a bone, the one Jacob had split in two without asking for anything back. That memory had teeth now. At some point in the dark, she stood and opened the drawer beneath the table. Along with the bullets and a coiled length of leather strap, she found an old tin box Jacob never spoke about. She opened it. Inside were letters, some yellowed, others untouched. A dried flower, lilac, a photograph or what was left of one with two faces she didn't recognize, faded from sun and time. A girl and a woman, smiling beside a mule cart. There was sorrow in the edges of that paper, grief pressed between folds. She closed the box without looking further. Whatever ghosts Jacob carried, they weren't hers to call by name. Rain hit the roof around midnight. Not hard, just steady, a drumbeat for thinking too long. She sat by the fire, sharpening a small knife on a flat stone, more out of habit than need. Her boots dripped onto the floorboards. In the silence between wind gusts, she heard it. A sound, not the cry of coyotes, not the flap of loose shutters. Something heavier, a boat step in mud. Then another, slow, measured. She stood, rifle in hand. Didn't breathe, didn't blink. The porch floor creaked, and then silence again. She waited an hour with the rifle pointed at the door. No knock came, no voice, no threat, but the air didn't feel empty. She didn't sleep. When dawn came, the only sign left behind was a single print in the mud, half washed by rain, but unmistakable. It wasn't Jacob's, and it hadn't walked away. The rain had stopped by morning, but the cabin walls still whispered with its memory. Water dripped from the porch in slow rhythm, steady like a ticking clock with no face. Outside, the land was hushed and swollen with mud. The fence sagged in places. The trail Jacob had taken was already washed clean, no hoofprints left, as if he'd never ridden out at all. Inside, Lila moved like a ghost, barefoot, quiet, carrying the rifle from room to room without reason. Her breath fogged the window pane. She pressed her fingers to the glass and counted the ridgelines through the mist. No sign of him yet. No birdsong either. She stirred the fire with the poker, watching coals blink like dying stars. The warmth touched her face but didn't reach her chest. It hadn't for hours. She wrapped the quilt tighter and sat in his chair, her boots nearby, laces still wet from last night. The print outside the one in the mud hadn't vanished. She checked it again at dawn, kneeling beside it in the gray light. It hadn't matched Jacob's boots, wasn't fresh either, not exactly. But it hadn't been there the day before. She didn't understand why that chilled her more than a rifle barrel would have. Some things didn't need to make sense. Some things just waited. A wolf howled once, far off toward Widow's Bluff. Lila didn't flinch. She listened. The sound was long, low, full of something she recognized but didn't name. It made her remember the first night Jacob found her sitting in red dust, a crust of bread in her lap and nothing else in her hands. She hadn't spoken then, not even when he offered water. She hadn't cried when they left her, hadn't begged to be taken back. But now she remembered the crack in her chest that night, how it felt like her ribs were made of glass, and every breath risked a shatter, how silence could be louder than any scream, and colder than any prairie wind. That's what this cabin held now. Not fear, not safety, something in between, the breath before a bullet lands. She walked outside mid-afternoon. The mud clung to her ankles. Wind tugged at her shirt like a restless child. She passed the gate, her name still faintly carved in the wood, though the rain had tried to wear it down. She stopped at the fence line. The land rolled out before her like a sleeping beast, calm, but not peaceful. Nothing out here was peaceful, just tired, just waiting to be disturbed. She stood still long enough to hear her heartbeat echo in her ears. She whispered the word mine, but the wind took it before it reached the grass. Back inside, she lit the lamp early. Not for light, there was still enough of that, but because the silence was getting too thick, it pressed against the walls, crawled into the corners. The fire snapped once, and she jumped. Her hand gripped the rifle stock too tight. She moved to the window, watched the trail, listened. Nothing. She opened Jacob's tin box again, not to read the letters, just to feel them. The dry paper, the shape of folded time. She touched the photograph but didn't turn it over. Some things weren't meant to be known all at once. She found a piece of cloth tucked beneath the paper's soft flannel, once part of a baby's shirt, or wrap maybe. She ran it between her fingers until the fabric felt warm again. And still, the trail stayed empty. When night came, she didn't light the other lamps. She didn't eat, just sat on the floor with the rifle across her knees, back to the wall, eyes on the door. A sound outside creaking wood. Could have been wind, could have been worse. She didn't move, didn't blink. The cabin held its breath with her. She thought of Jacob's voice, the way it always came slow, like he measured every word before setting it down. She missed the weight of that silence. The kind that wasn't empty, just full of things no one dared say. She missed his boots outside the door. She missed the sound of not being alone. The porch steps groaned under unfamiliar weight. Lila didn't rise. She sat still, rifle resting across her knees, breathing through her nose to keep the fear from rising. Dawn was just a smear on the horizon, copper bleeding into ash. The air smelled like wet cedar and cold iron storm gone, but not far. A shadow moved past the window, slow, intentional. Then a voice. "That's your name on the gate?" She knew that voice. Amos Kane. Lazy drawl twisted around a smile that never touched the eyes. She didn't answer. Another step, another creak. "No one around but a girl?" he called. That a mistake or just plain foolish? Still, she said nothing. She'd opened the window behind her earlier, just enough. If it came to fire, the crack would keep the smoke from choking her too fast. The floorboard outside sighed again. 2 more pairs of boots shuffled behind him. Same riders from the ridge, most likely. The ones with thin patience and fast fingers. She raised the rifle slowly, barrel pointed at the door. "You got until the count of 5, Amos said, to hand over that deed and step aside." She stood now, back straight, feet planted wide on the floorboards. She didn't yell, didn't warn. She just thumbed back the hammer. Outside, silence, not even a bird. Then, one knock. Slow, hollow. "I'm coming in," Amos said, but even his voice wavered now. Lila took 1 step toward the door, then another. Her voice came quiet, even. "This land ain't yours." The door latch twitched, and she fired. The shot tore through the top panel, not meant to hit, just to speak. The kind of speech folks remembered. Bootsteps scurried back. Curses. A second passed, then a third. Hoofbeats scrambled in the yard like fear trying to find its footing. She kept the rifle up, kept breathing slow, didn't blink. The door never opened. They didn't test her again. When the dust cleared and the yard grew still, she stepped out. The front porch was scattered with boot prints and 1 spent casing. She scanned the tree line, rifle tight against her shoulder, but they were gone. Jacob returned that evening, mud up to his stirrups, coat soaked through, beard dusted with road and rain. His eyes swept the yard first, then the porch, then the girl standing there, rifle still warm, though he didn't know that yet. They stared at each other for a long moment. He didn't ask what happened. She didn't explain. But something between them settled different now, not heavier, just deeper. He dismounted, tied the reins, and stepped up beside her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Fence'll need repair," she said. He glanced at the post where her name was still carved. "We'll fix it tomorrow." They sat that night by the fire. No talk of Kane. No talk of rifles or porch doors or what might return with the next moonrise. Just stew in the pot, the sound of wind through shutters, and silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, the kind that felt earned. Out past the boundary line, under a sky turned dark with questions, something waited, not because it was brave, but because it didn't believe the girl would dare fire twice. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, wrapped in an oversized coat, shivering in the morning mist. He hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, just stood there, small, silent, and too still for someone that young. Lila spotted him from the garden where she was pulling carrots, the dirt cold and wet in her hands. Her first thought was a ghost. Her second was memory. She dropped the spade, walked slow. The boy didn't flinch. He looked like she had months ago, eyes that had forgotten what safe meant, knees buckling but not falling, clutching a bundle so tight it might have held all that was left of him. She knew that look, knew the silence too. Jacob came out the door, saw them both, and stopped. His hand hovered near his belt, not the gun, just the habit. A man who'd lived too long on the edge of trouble always checked for weight before words. The boy blinked up at Lila, lips cracked, face half hidden by the coat's collar. She didn't ask questions. She took his hand. Inside, the fire was warm, the air thick with stew and old cedar. Jacob poured water, said nothing. Lila pulled out a second bowl, set it on the table like it had always been there. The boy drank first, then ate. Fast but not messy, like someone used to going hungry, not wild. No one asked his name. Some names needed earning back. Jacob watched Lila more than the boy. She wiped the child's mouth with a cloth, laid a dry blanket across his shoulders, then returned to her seat without speaking. The fire snapped in the hearth. Outside, the clouds gathered like bruises across the hills, but the wind hadn't turned yet. After supper, Lila took the boy to the loft. She rolled out her own quilt beside him, gave him the pillow Jacob had made from old feed sacks. He didn't speak, just lay still, eyes wide, as if he thought sleep might be a trap. She didn't ask where he came from, didn't ask who left him. She remembered too well the weight of those answers. Downstairs, Jacob sat in the same old chair, pipe unlit, staring into nothing. She shot, he said aloud, to no one. He could still see her standing in that doorway, rifle steady, jaw locked. The porch boards had blackened from the muzzle flash. Cain had fled. The land had stayed quiet since. But Jacob knew quiet didn't last out here. He looked toward the loft. She hadn't just protected the house. She'd claimed it. Next morning, Lila found the boy out near the fence line, barefoot, staring at her name carved into the wood. She didn't say a word. She just walked beside him, pulled her knife from her boot, and scratched a second name underneath it. Toby. The letters weren't even. They didn't need to be. Toby looked at it, looked at her. She offered him the knife. He shook his head. Not yet, he whispered. His voice cracked like something unused, but it was there. Jacob hammered new boards to the north fence. Lila stacked the wood. Toby followed behind with a bucket, gathering leftover nails and humming under his breath. That evening, 3 bowls sat on the table. No one said it, but everyone knew the place had changed. Not because of the gun, not because of Cain, but because someone small had found it and been kept. Later, when the wind picked up and the smell of coming cold drifted in through the chimney flue, Lila stood at the window. She saw the trail, saw nothing on it. But still, she whispered like a habit that had become a hope. We're still here, somewhere past the dark hills, beyond where the land remembered names. A rider watched the light in their window and thought not of vengeance, but of what it meant to be replaced.